Happy International Human Rights Day to everybody who's joining us this morning from wherever you are. If you're watching us on TV, if you're listening to us on radio, or you're watching us on our live streams, SpiceFM KE on YouTube, on Facebook, or on Twitter, Happy International Human Rights Day. Now, to commemorate this day, we have three more guests who are joining us, two who are in the studio. Samuel Orlando is Executive Director of Pamoja Trust, and we have Adeline Masinde, Adequate Housing Program Coordinator with We Effects. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Good morning.
Asanteni sana for joining us. I want to start with you, Adeline. What is We Effect?
We Effect is a non-governmental organization. Basically, we work with supporting cooperatives in the region, and we work with member-based organization. This is an organization that was formed in the 1950s just to show solidarity with the cooperative movement, to be able to give people possibilities to get together and organize their lives in terms of housing and in terms of sustainable rural development.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. And then now, Pamoja Trust.
We are a national civil society organization, but basically a social justice organization, and I think I'll explain that further.
Mm-hmm.
We work around adequate housing. We also do a lot of action-based research and also work with quite a number of community-based organizations and social movements to anchor economic and social rights. That's basically right to housing, right to basic education, right to social security, and right to water and sanitation.
So how do you do this?
So we do this on the basis of promoting models that are anchored on community innovations. And the community innovations is our remit that should inform the basis in which policies are developed. That policies should not be developed from the basis of mischief, but should anchor community aspirations and innovations on how to address their issues.
Okay. Let's also introduce our third guest, who is Charity Wangoi, Legal and Programs Officer at GROOTS Kenya. Good morning, Charity.
Good morning. How are you?
Very well, thanks. Thank you very much for joining us in the Situation Room. Tell us about GROOTS Kenya. Who is GROOTS Kenya?
Okay, GROOTS Kenya is a movement of grassroots women. Actually, GROOTS is an acronym that means Grassroots Organizations Operating Together in Sisterhood. So it's a group of CBOs and self-help groups that are women-led and that do a lot of work in the community. And we have been working around women in governance, women in land rights, climate change and agriculture, and women in technology and in health. So we work with grassroots women. Those are our people. So it's women and girls.
Why only women and girls?
Because everyone has a purpose in this life and everyone has a space they occupy. And so ours is for grassroots women. And also our history is that we were founded in 1995 after the Beijing conference. And so that was a conference that everyone dubbed women have been empowered and all that. So at that point, the founder was able to identify the target group. So in my opinion, we all have a role to play in the society. So our role is women and girls, and mostly grassroots women and girls. But it doesn't mean we don't offer legal advice to other target audiences, but we mostly work with women and girls.
Our specialization is a good thing, but when you say grassroots, who qualifies?
Your grassroots kind of woman is your auntie, your grandmother, the young lady who lives in the rural setting. So most of our women are based in the rural setting. So it's the outskirts of the cities. Though now Nakuru has become a city, so I don't know what happens to our women in Nakuru, but that is what we mean by grassroots women. So the women who are in the rural setting.
Is there something special about women in the rural setting that made you focus on them?
Yeah. One of the things that made us focus on women in the rural setting is that a lot of them at that time were not held with high regard, and a lot of people would disregard them in issues to do with decision making, participating in their own development. Like you'd see a woman walking without shoes, but she's a leader in her community. So the reason we focus on them is so that we can enable them to be increased in visibility, and that people would understand that they are also women like any other. Just because maybe some of them have not been able to access education, have not been able to increase their literacy skills, does not mean that they are not leaders in their own right. So that is why our target audience was rural women.
So, I mean, Adeline, focusing on where we are on International Human Rights Day. Why then is it important to commemorate this? I mean, across organizations. Why is that important?
Okay. It's very important for us to celebrate 10th December because it's when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was chartered in 1948. So it's important because we are celebrating all human rights, and that means that everyone who is a human being has a right to this right. So it's like we are celebrating us being human beings, and that is why it is important. Because at some point we had no structure or no written document. We used to rely on principles and values that were sent over generations. But just having a written document that clearly stipulates what are your rights, what are you entitled to, was a great achievement for the whole world. So I think it's important for us to celebrate ourselves as human beings and the rights that are entitled to us just by the fact that we are human beings. That's why we celebrate Human Rights Day.
For you, Adeline?
Yeah. I think also just to add on that, for us it's also important to really create awareness around rights that are entitled to the people that we work with, so that people can be aware and know that they have rights like to housing, rights to life, and that kind of thing. And also apart from that, we also find this as an opportunity to kind of create an agenda for advocacy, because we understand that there are rights that have not been realized. So it's an opportunity to also consolidate and see how we can engage in advocacy towards realization of our rights.
You talk about rights. It's a good thing, and it must be spoken of. Recently, we had a situation in this country where I know of one school where they had a referendum. And the idea was, do we go home for holidays or do we stay? And that in itself is an expression of this freedom. So, as we talk about freedom and as we talk about the need to understand our freedoms, is there a need for balancing? When is it that your freedom is good and is a public good, and at what point does it infringe on other people's goods, and at what point does it infringe on, should we say, societal, the balance? I hear a lot of talk about freedom and understanding, and I think it's an excellent thing, but the balance of it.
Thank you. I think rights comes with responsibilities.
And do people understand that?
And I think people do understand that, and the government understand that. So that then when you anchor responsibilities...
Was that a question, or was it rhetorical?
It was a rhetorical question. Yeah, because when we speak about responsibilities, then there are spaces upon which people then anchor these responsibilities, the concept of public participation, the concept of equity, the concept of equality, and how this anchors social justice. And today we are speaking about, reducing inequalities and advancing human rights. So then to what extent, as a nation, can we say that based on income, we are equal? That based on the value of life, we are equal? That based on gender, we are equal? To what extent can we say that? So that then we say that who is responsible and on whose table do they sit? And that's a major question that then comes with the International Human Rights Day, that whereas you claim you're right, then you've got particular responsibilities.
We've seen with this look at development, so the government is focused on development and all, and that's where now the inequalities have emanated, where we see people complaining that with development, we are seeing people being evicted from their homes. You're seeing people being rendered homeless overnight because something needs to be put up here and being constructed here. How do you balance these two? How do we make sure that even the rights of the most vulnerable in the society are still upheld as we focus on development?
Thank you. One of the things that I think we've not learned as a nation is to also appreciate where we've come from. That we did have a framework in which was to guide development, and actual development now is anchored as one of the economic and cultural rights, that people have got a right to development. But are there lenses of human rights-based approaches to development? When you look at Nairobi and scan around Nairobi, you see what happened in Mukuru. That's a very recent case where the Nairobi Metropolitan Services are saying that we didn't carry out the evictions. The county government is saying that we didn't carry out the evictions. Kenya Land Roads Authority is saying that we didn't carry out evictions. But who carried out the evictions?
Evictions were carried out.
And the evictions were carried out. And illegally. And they admit. So then who carried out evictions? Then we ask ourselves, do we have instances upon which government have done development without forcefully evicting people? Go to Outer Ring Road. When they were constructing the road, they did not evict anyone. They applied human rights-based approaches to developing that road, and Kenya Land Roads Authority did a splendid job. So as human rights organization, then we question government. If you did it so well in Outer Ring Road, why didn't you apply the same standards in
Mukuru and Korogocho?
Because it means that you can,
You
right?
can, exactly.
So then even as we are looking at this and saying, all right, so we've already seen that there is... there's a trampling on some of these rights, socioeconomic rights, and across board. But then there are also instances where these then are upheld.
Yes.
So how would you rate Kenya's commitment right now as a nation, Kenya's commitment to upholding socioeconomic rights across board?
Adeline wants me to take that. I'll say 5. I'll say 5 because we've done so well within the policy and legal
5
framework.
out of what?
Out of 10.
Okay.
So that then what we failed to transition to is the implementation element of it and learning from our good practice. And that's why as organizations like Pamoda Trust, what we zero in on is documenting the best practices that have been evidenced by government and communities. Then we use them to engage in policy debates. So then what we did do is to go and document what happened in Outer Ring Road and develop what we call a stakeholder engagement framework. And we went back to Kenya Land Roads Authority and told them that this was your framework that you applied at Outer Ring Road. Why can't you implement the same in other roads that you are, implementing in Kenya? And also within the same breath, when you look at the housing sector, as a nation, we've appreciated the place of cooperatives as a driver, in enhancing access to housing, particularly for the low-income earners. And we still go ahead to legislate on the Kenya Mortgage Refinancing Company that's basically run by commercial banks. When you look at the board, I don't want to call names because I'm on air. But the board is commercial banks who are driven by the
But it's in the public domain. The names were there. It's in the public domain. So even if you mention it, you will not be infringing on anybody's rights.
Yeah, so then perhaps we will have asked ourselves, and Adeline here will ask herself that what is the place of housing corporates within the board that manages the Kenya Mortgage Refinancing Company? If we say that 60 to 70% of our population live in informal settlements and live in a cooperative way of life where they contribute intermittently on a daily basis, and this has been a driver upon which they access housing. Why don't we see this reflected within the Kenya Mortgage Refinancing Company? I think it's something Adeline can expand.
Maybe then going to the next question, I think that the one that bring that in then, Adeline. So now as what your organization does, specifically wherever it is represented, to make sure that these rights, socioeconomic rights, then are being upheld. And if we don't see it happening in different sectors, then the question is why? So I guess the first one is then, what exactly is being done by your organization, where it is represented, land, proper housing and things like that? What are some of the things that are being done that you have committed to?
Well, basically, I'd also maybe just say that our organization we are not an implementing organization, but we work through member-based organizations, like, for example, Pamoja, and also through the cooperative movement. So our voice basically is heard through the member organizations on the ground. But definitely
so we is facilitating some of these other organizations to get the job done.
Exactly. And also when you talk about, like, for example, human rights, we are facilitating a process where organizations are able to monitor implementation of human rights in the country and participate in the universal periodic review process, and also just be able to ensure that shadow reports are kind of produced so that the government is also put on check. We're also promoting issues of gender equality. just to make sure that also there is empowerment so that this woman at the grassroots can be able to know her rights and just demand, but of course through building of social movements. And that's why we're using like the cooperative as a vehicle to bring people without possibilities. Actually, we really focus on the very poor of the poor, people who cannot really speak, from an individual perspective, but get organized so that together they can come together and demand their rights.
What is facilitating involved with it?
Facilitating basically means, I would say, capacity building the capacity of organizations to be able to reach out to their members on the ground.
You do know I'm going to ask you what is capacity building.
Well, it's a whole range. I would say, let me say it's a whole range of issues, but basically we look at it from, first of all, identifying the gaps within the organization to make sure that they have systems and procedures in place to operate. That means that they have to put in place like the relevant policies and make sure that it guides their operation. Then also they have the responsibility to now organize community member-based organizations into like cooperatives, build their capacity again in terms of strengthening the cooperatives to operate like independent institutions, autonomous institutions. But of course we do this through financing. And then we have like a program which is implemented over 3 years and we monitor. But basically we would just give like more of the technical aspect. And if we don't have it internally within We Effect, then we also outsource, work with like bodies like CORAT or other bodies that can give us that capacity to be able to support the member-based organizations.
Charity, what does GROOTS do then also to make sure that everybody in the grassroots, like you said, is aware of their rights and is able to push for their rights?
Okay. As GROOTS Kenya, we are an implementing partner. I think we also work with We Effect. So she has mentioned capacity building, and one of the things we do with capacity building is that once we've identified the gap, we bring the women together and teach them. So we increase their skills, whether it's in agriculture, whether it's in knowing their rights. We teach them the rights of specific things. For example, if it's land reclamation, we partner with government and other partners. We go do training at the grassroots. So we don't go and train in the boardrooms. We go to the community. We sit with them, we teach them, then we give them like a period of time to see the change in behavior. So we also link them with stakeholders who are in those particular government offices because we realize we can't work independently. We have to work through multi-sectorial approaches. So that's what we do. And because we are organized, because ideally we do the mapping of these women and organize them in groups, it means it's easy to track the changes and see the impact of what they are doing in their communities. So that's what we do. Yeah, we also do peer-to-peer approaches. So we take, like, for example, women from Tana River and take them to a place like Makueni to see what Makueni is doing. So they're doing like a benchmarking exercise. That shows that whatever is being taught in theory can also be done in practice. So what you see, you will never forget. So when you go back to your community, you carry some of the practices from one community to the other that will work for them. So that's what we've been doing over the years.
Okay.
Yeah.
We're talking about promoting a human rights-based approach to sustainable development. And first, we started by, just before we get into the news, into trying to define the sustainable development bit. So how do we then promote a human rights-based approach to that?
I think before I hand over to Adeline, it brings the question of the centrality of the principles of governance. And the question that we will ask ourselves is the question as to whether our governance system anchor equity, whether they anchor human dignity, whether they anchor sharing and devolution of power that we've attempted to do in our constitution, whether it anchors patriotism, national unity, good governance, non-discrimination that we speak so eloquently in Article 27 for our constitution, and whether the tenets of human rights are reflected therein. And it's interesting that Azimio la Umoja coincidentally is on 10th. So then I want to also call upon Kenyans to look at the conversations in Kasarani vis-a-vis the principles of good governance. So that then that becomes a basis of the conversation in which we engage the political class.
Adeline, how do we then promote human rights-based approach to sustainable development?
Well, I think how we're doing it is basically focusing on a human rights-based approach to programming. And basically, there are key elements that we look at. First of all, we encourage participation, that for any project to be sustainable, then all those involved should participate. Participate in terms of decision making, in terms of accessing, in terms of controlling of resources or whatever it is. And then secondly, also we are looking at linkages. Linkages in terms of how this right you're trying to address is linked to the framework that exists. Because then you can be able to have a basis of articulating the right that you're trying to address. And then we're also promoting issues of accountability in terms of who is accountable to who, so that the people we are targeting, as he said, know that they have responsibilities, but they're also duty bearers who have to facilitate realizations of this right. So they have to understand that chain so that when they're articulating their rights, they know who to approach. Apart from accountability, we are also looking at issues of non-discrimination. I think we are trying to make sure that the programs we are developing address issues of non-discrimination, especially for the most vulnerable and especially for the women. I think we focus a lot on women because we realize that they are disadvantaged in one way or the other. So when it comes to designing the project, then that has to be taken care of. And then also there's the issue of transparency. Accountability from both ends. They have to be accountable, and also there has to be accountability from the state. So basically, and then there's the issue of empowerment. We are focusing a lot on empowering them, but we also need to empower the duty bearers, because we realize that for them also to help these people realize their rights, they have to be empowered. So it's kind of like a two-way empowerment process. So I think with that, we can be able to have more sustainable programs.
And so for Charity, for you, as you look at GROOTS and then what GROOTS is currently doing in the country, and I'm sure from where you sit, then you would say, okay, there's still a lot more that needs to be done for us to get there. So what are some of the much more that need to be done in terms of implementation, in terms of realization of some of the lack of the implementation of rights that's happening?
Things we can do is ensure that there's accountability and citizens owning these processes. Because I think one of the things that has been very apparent even in the recent past is that a lot of the implementation of programs has not been owned by the people who are benefiting from this particular program or this particular project of development. So I think one of the things is ownership and inclusion. That would mean it would reduce the inequality gap between the haves and the have-nots, and that would mean that we'll have the progressive realization as has been stated before. So I think having this, like our approach at GROOTS Kenya, is that we do the bottom-up approach, that we start at the grassroots and ensure that the women themselves own these particular programs, and then we create the linkages. When we create the linkages, we enable the women to keep these stakeholders accountable, or duty bearers, if you may. So I feel like if there's inclusion and people who own these particular issues, then they will have the voice to be able to hold their leaders accountable, because they will come from a point of knowing what is entitled to them. I think with that, we can reduce the inequality gap between the haves and the have-nots, because at a point of knowledge and knowing what you're entitled to and the resources that are available for you to be able to participate also enables you to reduce the gap. So you're able to argue and have a seat at the table. Yeah.
This question is to the three of you, but let me start with you, Charity, and you can begin by answering. I'll give the other two wonderful people an opportunity to say their bit. Everything that I hear you people say is wonderful and it's good, but it isn't a bottom-up, it's a top-down. I say it's a top-down because I don't hear of any conversation where you go to the people and find out what it is they want, what they need, and how they'd like it done, so that you can tailor-make all these wonderful ideas to suit the needs that they have told you they have. You seem to be coming from a position of you know what they want and you're giving to them. How do you arrive at this?
No. Actually, it's the opposite. It is, at least for our project implementation. Like, for example, myself, I only offer technical support for the women. They do all the work. So it is a bottom-up approach, at least from where I'm standing from. Because it's not like we go with
if
a
you're offering
project.
support, have they
Yes.
told you what they need?
Exactly. Yes, they have. That's how we do our program. So we actually go to the ground. They tell us exactly what they need. Most recently, they were telling us that they want to learn more about climate smart agriculture. And what we did is we were able to link with county governments to be able to access this particular knowledge. And once they go and access this knowledge, they run with it. So I can say without a shadow of doubt, for us, we go to the community, identify what the issue is. For even most recently, we had the increase in gender-based violence cases, and what happened is we created a community network, and it came from the women themselves. They say they are being overwhelmed by all these cases, and that people, like the leaders in their communities, are coming to them, trying to assist them, ask them for assistance. So they wanted to do it more professionally and more legally. So what happened? We trained them, and they ran with it. So for us, we don't bring projects for them to do. We get the projects from them and now source for funding so that we are able to support them.
Really?
Yes. Yeah. And that's why we consider ourselves a movement as opposed to an NGO.
Thank you. From where I sit, basically, as I said, we do not implement directly, but we do what we call a multidimensional poverty analysis, just to understand like the poverty aspects in the region, because we work in East Africa, just to be able to understand areas that are mostly affected by poverty and what are the issues, what opportunities do they have, what resources are they lacking, and then based on that we design our programs. But also besides that, we also do a baseline just to be able to really again articulate these issues. Then from that level now, our partner organizations also now, then that is how we design our program. Then we have now partners who will also design a program that feeds into the regional program. And their program now directly kind of targets the people at the grassroots.
The question you raise is on evidence-informed policy. And that communities themselves have got innovations that should find their way into policies.
And that communities also know what they need.
And the communities also know what they need.
Yes.
That's why the conversation has shifted from capacity building to capacity strengthening. So then what we raise is that how can innovations around the cooperative life in terms of access to housing be reflected in the policy framework? When you talk about road infrastructure, how can stakeholder engagement framework in Outer Ring influence stakeholder engagement policy within Kenya National Highway Authority and Kenya Urban Roads Authority? But we're also appreciating that our policy space has got a particular culture, that from independence, the policy space was informed by mischief, that we were putting penalties on statutes to address particular limitations or what we would perhaps would refer as crime, or to compel people to do particular things. We were not appreciating the culture of our people to inform policy. And I want to give you an example. In most occasions, when we train our engineers, we give them a blank sheet and tell them that, can you design a road? We don't tell them that when you're designing a road, there's Kangemi market. That when you're designing a road, there's Kibra informal settlement. So that their designs are on a plain sheet. So then, this takes us back to our curriculum. You know, how do we train people from the universities? How do we train our technical persons? How do they engage with evidence and innovations of communities to inform policies? And that's the space that Pamoja Trust comes in. So that then we say, okay, fine, we are not going to invent anything new. We just want to document what we've done well as a government. And we'll have a conversation with you based on that.
Okay.
So that then we change the policy cultures.
So you're at that point. You play at that level, at
Exactly.
influencing policy
Exactly.
and influencing programs at national
Exactly.
level and
Exactly.
also county government level.
Exactly.
We comes in at programmatic design and seeing then what programs can be designed, and then GROOTS comes and says we are a movement. We see what people are saying. So GROOTS is basically also feeding you. There's a feedback loop.
Exactly.
Okay. I understand it. It's 19 minutes after 9, and we want to thank you very much for joining us today. Asanteni sana as you go and celebrate the International Human Rights Day. I know that you have very many programs that you'll be running today and throughout into the next year. Continue doing the good job that you're doing.
Thank you so much for having us.
Asante. Samuel Orlando is the Executive Director of Pamoja Trust. Adeline Masinde is the Adequate Housing Program Coordinator with We Effect. And Charity Wangoi is the Legal and Programs Officer at GROOTS Kenya. Thank you for joining us, and happy International Human Rights Day.
Thank you.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.